This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one website platform. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today's script was provided by Ben Edelman. Be sure to check the links in the description and strap in for one hell of a story. Pun intended. For centuries, London has been considered one of the world's greatest cities. Growing from a small Roman settlement on the north bank of the River Thames, today it is a huge metropolis, a world center for finance, the arts, education, and culture. It is one of the most visited places in the world and has for centuries been the capital of first England and then the United Kingdom. But that's today's London. 350 years ago, London was cramped, dirty, overcrowded, and dangerous. It was also a tinderbox. For 3 days in September 1666, a fire raged out of control in the capital, burning virtually the entire city to the ground. It was a disaster with few parallels in history. The fire was so destructive, the death toll will never be known with certainty. Many thousands of people were left not just homeless, but penniless as the fire consumed their houses, their businesses, and all their worldly goods. Rebuilding would take years, and London was never the same again. It is commonly said that modern-day London first rose from the ashes of the Great Fire, which is true to an extent. Many of the changes made in the aftermath still exist in the city today. But the story of the Great Fire of London is hardly a triumphant one. It is a tale of incompetence, selfishness, and just plain foolishness. Combine these elements with one of nature's most destructive forces, fire, and you have a recipe for disaster. If you don't want your business to go down in flames like London, then you're gonna need a stylish and well-optimized website. And guess what? Today's sponsor, Squarespace, is just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform, perfect for entrepreneurs, whether you're a civil engineer trying to let people know that building things entirely out of wood is probably a bad idea, or a filmmaker trying to get your Great Fire of London documentary off the ground. Squarespace has all the tools you need to get the job done, all in one place and on your terms. With Squarespace's next-generation website engine, the Fluid Engine, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And unlike using an expensive web designer, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile from the get-go. With Squarespace's guided design system, Squarespace Blueprint, and their brand spanking new AI and SEO tools, you'll be able to pick from a curated list of layout and styling options to ensure you're able to build your brand the way you want from the ground up, and make sure your website hits all those SEO sweet spots, ensuring you reach the right people to grow your audience the way you want. And best of all, if you're selling stuff on your website, Squarespace offers flexible payment options with simple but powerful tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay. And in eligible countries, your customers will have the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, back to the video. In the year 1666, London was still largely confined to an area located inside the city walls, originally built by the Romans some 1500 years earlier. Access to the city was limited to passing through one of the 8 city gates, which were commonly gridlocked with traffic. Only one bridge existed to connect London with the southern bank of the River Thames, and that was also frequently crowded with traffic. At the same time, the population of London had quadrupled in the past 100 years, as more and more people immigrated from the countryside to seek work in the capital. With more than 300,000 residents, London was more than 75% more populous than the next 5 largest towns in England combined. The result was that London's population was crammed into a space that simply hadn't been built to handle them. London's street plan was virtually unchanged from the early Middle Ages, featuring narrow, twisting streets and houses built so close together they might as well be one large building. In order to accommodate the growing population, builders had to get creative. Many houses and shops were built with jetties, where the upper floors of the building stuck out further than the lower floors, like an upside-down staircase. This allowed for added space without encroaching on the street. Many buildings featured 4 or more stories that protruded further and further, to the point that buildings that were across from the street from each other nearly touched. This cast the streets below into a near-permanent state of gloom where sunlight rarely touched, and those walking on them ran the horrifying risk of having a chamber pot dumped directly on their heads. Indoor plumbing wouldn't come to London for another 2 centuries. The reason for the overcrowding was that London was already the economic heart of the nation by this time. The city was the main point of entry for ships bearing trade goods from all over the world, as well as from the rest of Britain. Tobacco from America, spices from the Far East, coal from Newcastle, textiles from Flanders, and 1,000 more. The city was a center of manufacturing and was the home of the great halls of the livery companies, the trade guilds that encompassed virtually every conceivable profession from glassblowers to fishmongers. The city's marketplaces, the largest of which was the Royal Exchange, sold practically every commodity available at that time. London was known as the country's capital, but the machinery of national government wasn't actually located in London at the time. King Charles II, who had been restored to the throne in 1660, and his administration were located in the Palace of Whitehall, while Parliament met at Westminster, at the time its own city. Although located only a few miles outside the city walls, Whitehall might as well have been on a different planet than London was. Charles didn't seem particularly eager to run the country, devoting most of his time to drinking, carousing, and debauchery. The enormous sums of money he was spending made him very unpopular, particularly in London, where many residents were veterans of the late Civil War, which had resulted in the deposition and execution of the king's father, Charles I. 1666 was a very hot, dry year for London. By September, the city was in its 10th straight month of drought, day after day of the merciless hot sun baking down on the buildings and people. The drought just made the likelihood of a serious fire even higher than normal in London, a city where fires were already an uncomfortable fact of life at that time. Potential sources of ignition were everywhere: fireplaces, torches, candles, ovens and furnaces, discarded matches, clay pipes for smoking tobacco. The list went on and on. Most of the houses in London were made of wood. Only the parish churches and other large buildings were made out of more substantial brick or stone. Official ordinances regarding proper construction to deter fires in the city were almost never enforced. Even without the benefit of hindsight, it isn't too hard to see that London was an accident waiting to happen. At about 1 a.m. on September 2nd, a fire broke out in the home of Thomas Fariner, a baker who primarily made ship's biscuits for the Royal Navy. This is, of course, bread made of flour, water, and salt baked rock hard in order to preserve it. It's also known as hardtack. The fire spread quickly and ferociously, forcing Fariner, his daughter, and a servant to flee for their lives by jumping from the roof of the building to that of his neighbor. The Fariner's maid, too frightened to follow them, remained in the burning building and became the first fatality of the Great Fire of London. The neighborhood was roused from slumber by the shrill call of "Fire! Fire!" and the pealing of church bells. Up and down Pudding Lane, residents emerged from their homes to see the Fariner Bakery on fire. This was a time before professional firefighting services had been established. It was up to the citizens themselves to fight the blaze using the limited tools available at their disposal. Wooden pipes under the street were supposed to carry a supply of water for this purpose, and tools such as ladders, axes, and buckets were required to be kept in churches and other public buildings. But a number of factors conspired against those trying to fight the fire at this early stage, when it might have been successfully contained. The reservoirs of water were low because of the drought, making it difficult to put enough water on the blaze. An easterly wind, described as gale force, was acting like a giant bellows on the fire, flooding it with oxygen to feed off of. To make things worse, not enough people were around to help fight the fire. Most of Thomas Fariner's neighbors were too busy packing up as many of their own possessions as they could and fleeing with them to help, having already given up their own houses as lost. At this time, the Lord Mayor of London, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, arrived on the scene. Bloodworth was a political appointee, owing his position more to his connections at court than his leadership capabilities. The Lord Mayor was unimpressed, to say the least, when he viewed the fire, and uttered a statement that haunted him for the rest of his life. As he said, "Pish, a woman could piss it out." And then, needing his beauty sleep, he went back to bed. The fire soon spread from the Farriner's house to the surrounding dwellings, fed by the wind and the tinder of dry wooden buildings. One of the buildings housed a ship's chandler that contained 24 barrels of tar used to caulk wooden planking in ships. The superheated tar burst out from the barrels with explosive force, spreading shrapnel and burning wreckage in all directions. Now, the only way to stop the fire from spreading was to create fire breaks by pulling down houses that weren't yet on fire. But the Lord Mayor, who had returned to the scene after being informed of the fire's spread, refused to give the order because he didn't want to be responsible for compensating the homeowners whose buildings he wrecked. By the time a royal order to do so came in from Whitehall, it was too late. The flames spread out of Pudding Lane towards the Thames riverbank, burning the great warehouses full of goods, some of which were highly combustible, like, gunpowder, and also burned the northern half of the buildings on London Bridge before being stopped by an inadvertent firebreak created by an earlier fire in 1633, thus saving the community of Southwark on the south bank of the Thames from meeting London's fate. Stopped by the river, the fire instead pushed west towards the city's center, setting houses alight faster than they could be pulled down. 12 hours after it started, it had become a firestorm, the most dangerous kind of conflagration. The fire was now sucking in air from all directions as it consumed everything in its path, leaving a vacuum that rushed to be filled. This made the fire self-sustaining as long as there was fuel enough to burn, and the wooden buildings provided plenty of that. The powerful updrafts threw embers and firebrands high into the air where they landed on houses far away from the center of the blaze, starting additional fires. A wall of heat spread away from the fire in all directions, heating up materials that weren't on fire to the point that they spontaneously combusted. With conditions like this, entire city blocks could be up in flames in a matter of seconds. This type of fire would be a challenge to contain for the most experienced of modern firefighters. The citizens of London stood absolutely no chance. People tried desperately to get themselves and their possessions out of the reach of the flames. Some accounts record people having to flee 4 or 5 times in one day. People placed their belongings within the walls of local churches, hoping that the stone buildings would resist the fire. But the flames found their way inside through windows and doors, setting everything alight inside and leaving the church a hollow, burned-out shell, assuming the structure itself didn't completely collapse. After only attempting to fight the fire for a few hours, Thomas Bloodworth apparently gave up and left the scene, claiming to need rest. He would not be seen for the remainder of the crisis. The resulting gap in leadership was filled by King Charles and his brother James, the Duke of York. Charles put his brother in command of the city during the crisis, and the experienced military commander immediately set to work, commanding the efforts to fight the fire, ineffective though they may be. On the second day of the fire, it spread to the heart of the city. No longer just burning poor residences, but the financial district, including the banks, post office, and the printing office of the London Gazette, which had just managed to put out its Monday edition before the flames reached them. The Royal Exchange went up in flames, the golden grasshopper atop it crashing to the ground along with the rest of the building. The blaze consumed the East India Company's entire stockpile of spices stored in the basement, lending an exotic smell to the chaos for a few minutes. Spicy. People by this point had lost themselves to blind panic. The city's gates were clogged with people trying to evacuate the city. They clashed with people trying to get into the city to either fight the fire or to recover goods before they burned. Rumors began to swirl that the fire hadn't been an accident. The English were at war with both France and the Dutch Republic, and immediate suspicion was cast on foreign agents who had deliberately fired the city. And this unfortunately led to angry mobs setting upon any foreigner they found, beating them bloody and, in a few cases, to death. Other characters took advantage of the chaos to attempt to enrich themselves. Houses in the fire's path were being looted by robbers, some of whom stayed even when the roof had caught fire. Others accepted money to transport goods out of the city, only to vanish with the contents of the wagons and the money both. Not even the wigs on people's heads were safe. One story tells of a group of boys who reached down from the top of a wall to snatch them right off fleeing Londoners. On the fire's third day, It reached the most famous building in the city, St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's was the seat of the Bishop of London, one of the largest and oldest buildings in the city, dating back to 1087. Most of the merchants, especially booksellers around St. Paul's, stashed their stock in the church, figuring that if any building could withstand the fire, it would be the cathedral. But like with all the other churches it destroyed, the ravenous beast found its way in. Since the building was already being renovated at the time, the wooden scaffolding surrounding the building certainly didn't help. The great bells in the tower came crashing to the ground with a thunderous roar. Everything inside burned. Even the stones on the walls began to explode like grenades as the water inside them expanded. The fire also spread east, now threatening another building dating back to the Norman conquest, the Tower of London. This was a very serious problem because the tower was where the crown kept its reserves of gunpowder for the military, at least 500,000 pounds of it. If the fire reached it, the resulting explosion would have been horrific, likely destroying the bridge and every building for hundreds of yards around it, killing thousands. Sailors and citizens frantically loaded barrel after barrel of powder onto ships, which sent it downriver to arsenals out of the fire's path, while firefighters used some of it to demolish buildings and create a firebreak. The flames went all the way to the tower's moat, but the future World Heritage Site was spared destruction. The same could not be said for Guildhall, the administrative center of London, or for the city's western gates, which now caught fire. The flames had broken through the wall to the west and now burned houses outside of it, even jumping over the river fleet to buildings on the western bank. King Charles was now worried that Westminster and Whitehall were now under threat. As a result, he made plans to move the royal exchequer out of the city, and important papers were being packed away in case the court needed to move quickly. At its height, the noise of the fire could be heard as far away as Oxford, 50 miles distant, and the smoke from the blaze made the sky hazy on the Scottish borders, over 400 miles to the north. And if you're wondering why we're using miles or the imperial system instead of metric, it's probably because at that time they would likely still be using imperial units to measure things. At least that's what I'm guessing. But finally, on September 5th, the fourth day, the wind from the east died down, and that, combined with the effective fire breaks the Duke of York's men were making with gunpowder, finally put an end to the Great Fire. What was left behind was, in the words of Samuel Pepys, the saddest sight of desolation I ever saw. Survivors walking through the ruins noted that the city was so hot it scorched their shoes, and saw basement cellars full of goods still burning everywhere. The city's wells were so hot the water boiled in them for days after the fire was put out. The most apt comparison anyone could make about London after the fire was a hellscape, because surely this is what hell must have looked like. The destruction wrought by the Great Fire was almost total. Only the northeastern section of the city had been spared destruction. Over 80% of the buildings within the city walls were destroyed. The blaze claimed over 13,000 houses, 87 churches, the halls of 52 livery companies, as well as most of the civic buildings of the city, including prisons, orphanages, and the customs house. As many as 200,000 people, 2/3 of the population, were homeless. In monetary terms, the value of the lost property was estimated to be at least £9 million, equivalent to over £2 billion in today's money, 2.7 billion USD. Many thousands lost not only their homes, but all of their possessions and wealth. There were no insurance companies to compensate them for the loss. Surprisingly, for such a destructive fire, the official death toll was extremely low. Only 6 people were originally believed to have perished in the disaster. However, many modern historians think this is a dramatic undercount. They argue that, given the large number of Londoners that were displaced, it would have been really hard to know who had died and who had moved away after the fire. The records of many of the city's parish churches, which for many people was the only record kept that they were even alive, burned in the fire along with the buildings themselves. The fire was so hot that it is likely to have cremated the bodies of any victims, leaving nothing behind. As a result, the true death count will never be known. Rumors and paranoia were rampant in the city after the fire. Few people believed that the fire was accidental, and the confession of a French watchmaker named Robert Hubert seemed to reinforce that notion. Hubert was convicted of the crime of firing the city of London and was hanged in October 1666. his dead body literally being torn apart by an angry mob afterwards. However, few people today believe Hubert was actually guilty. It was clear from descriptions given at the time that the man was mentally ill, and it is also possible he confessed under torture, hardly a reliable lie detector. Today, most historians believe the Great Fire to have been an accident, probably started somewhere around the ovens of Thomas Farriner's bakery that fateful night. The dry conditions, the strong wind, and the medieval construction of London's buildings did the rest. It took decades for London to recover from the Great Fire. Despite grandiose plans that would have transformed London's geography completely, eventually it was decided to rebuild with virtually the same street plan as before the fire. Although in accordance with new regulations, the streets would be wider, and the construction of wooden buildings was banned in the city. Famed architect Christopher Wren's firm was responsible for rebuilding many of the more prominent buildings lost to the fire, including over 50 churches. The crown jewel, though, was St. Paul's, on which construction wouldn't finish until 1711, 45 years after the fire. The official monument to the Great Fire of London, commonly known simply as the Monument, was dedicated in 1677. It is 202 feet high and located 202 feet away from where the Great Fire started on Pudding Lane. The monument originally contained an inscription blaming the Popish faction for starting the fire, as it was a common belief at the time that the fire was a plot by Catholics. This was chiseled off the monument in 1830. The street plan of the rebuilt London is essentially unchanged today in central London, although the old city is only a small portion of what is now known as Greater London, a huge metropolis of over 10 million people. Despite the lessons learned from the Great Fire, this would not be the last time a major city burned. The US city of Chicago had their own Great Fire in 1871, America, with most of the same factors at play: dry conditions, strong winds, and an over-reliance on wooden construction. London itself burned again in 1940, although this was caused by aerial bombing from the German Luftwaffe during World War II. The second Great Fire of London burned an area wider than the original fire, although this time, thanks to firefighting efforts, St. Paul's Cathedral was saved. The Great Fire of London was an accident, but it was an accident brought about by human failures. It showcased in stark clarity that municipal government should be responsible for enforcing safe building codes to make sure a similar disaster never happens again. It also showed that in a fire, experienced professionals need to be on hand in order to safely extinguish the blaze. The roots of the modern professional fire service are in the ashes of the Great Fire of London. Well, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it as enlightening as I did. Once again, pun intended. And if you did, be sure to do all that algorithmic jazz and keep it tuned here to Geographics for more videos like this. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.